Welcome to the Progressive Perspective with Ron Rivers. In this week's Progress Report, we're going to discuss 5 key takeaways from Bernie Sanders' recently released Green New Deal. It's a pretty expansive plan filled with a lot of details about what we'll spend and how we're going to spend it. I don't believe it's an exaggeration to say that this is the boldest policy plan put forth by any candidate or legislator over the past 50 years. And after reviewing the plan, I've come away with 5 key takeaways that I believe every progressive should understand about the Green New Deal. Thank you for listening to the Progressive Perspective. Recently, Bernie Sanders and his team released a comprehensive plan outlining the details of the Green New Deal. It is the most visionary political document presented by any candidate over the past 50 years and holds the potential for genuine transformation of our circumstance. I dived deep into the material and have 5 key takeaways that every American voter should know. The first takeaway is that Trump's base would be one of the largest benefactors of the Green New Deal. A large part of Trump's campaign was to bring coal back, which was an empty promise that could never be realized no matter how genuine the effort. Our economics of energy production and distribution are changing based on 2 key factors. First, and most importantly, is the existential crisis we face with the climate catastrophe. It was inevitable that as climate change became more pronounced, the majority of the public would come together around a shared desire for a globally cooperative solution. What wasn't inevitable was Republican lawmakers partnering with corporations to lie and mislead to the public about the consequences of our circumstance. This deception laid the foundation for the present kind of bait and switch impacting our laboring brothers and sisters throughout the United States. Second is that green energy technology advancements are being driven by the exponential growth of information technologies and processing power. Essentially, this means that improvements in green energy will continue the trend of being more efficient and lower costs than fossil fuel technologies. In the pursuit of radical truth, we have to acknowledge that we haven't even scratched the surface. Future advancements in nanotechnology, for example, will dramatically accelerate progress in green energy tech beyond anything that's available presently. Bernie's plan is revolutionary in recognizing that no human being's worth should be tied to their occupation in a time where the quickest pathway to wealth is to disrupt industries, right? That's the entire startup culture. It's an idea that should have many Trump voters switching parties to vote for Bernie in the Democratic primary. The Green New Deal proposes spending $1.3 trillion to ensure fossil fuel and other carbon-intensive industry workers receive the tools needed to successfully transition into the new industries. This includes 5 years of wage guarantees, relocation and job placement assistance, retraining in the form of higher education or vocational training, housing vouchers, stronger labor standards, incentivizing employers to hire transitioning employees via tax incentives, and investing in the communities most impacted by this transition. Bernie's plan is profound in that he's the only candidate willing to confront the growing pains of transitioning head-on and ensuring that the approach is human-centric. It's a direct investment in those who would be most impacted by this necessary transition to essentially help them reestablish agency within their lives. To some extent, all of our taxes are going to fund this project, even though many will not benefit directly. And it presents progressives with the perfect opportunity to turn the tables on isolationist narratives. Bear this burden with pride. Tell everyone you are excited to chip in and help other Americans change the direction of their lives. It's the beginning of a new political philosophy in the United States and is the only real hope of preventing a Trump 2.0, whether that's Trump again or another manifestation of him. Perhaps most importantly is it could create a much deeper base for the progressive movement here in the United States by tying our working class into a more collaborative approach towards the structuring of society. The long-term impacts of this is hard to estimate accurately, but a victory for Bernie would likely change our political landscape for the foreseeable future. I imagine it would spell the end of the modern Republican Party and begin a cascading effect to oust existing corporate-sponsored Democrats. The second takeaway is that the Green New Deal takes the advice of climate scientists seriously. Climate scientists aren't pulling any punches when it comes to the severity of the crisis at hand. Recently, Harvard professor James Anderson spoke at length about how recovery is essentially all but impossible without a World War II style transformation of industry in the United States. World War II was one of the most productive eras of American history, and a time where people believed in something really bigger than themselves. Economically, he's referring to a mobilized effort, an investment to halt carbon pollution and remove it from the atmosphere. And while the current consensus outlined in the Green New Deal is about 11 years, Professor Anderson is trying to amplify the message that we only really have 5 years. Now, the Green New Deal recognizes that to begin the transformation, we have to cut ties with the past ways of doing things. So the plan includes an end to fossil fuel subsidies, sanctions on corporations that act against our national climate goals. So if a corporation does something in the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish, they'll severely be punished. It's a ban on offshore drilling, an end to new fossil fuel infrastructure projects, a ban on exporting fossil fuels, banning fracking and mountaintop removal coal mining, and a repeal of Trump's executive orders to allow the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines to continue. Bernie's proposal also does one thing that every other Democrat in history has been afraid to do, which is hold corporate polluters responsible for their actions. Under his plan, the fossil fuel industry and investors will face steep tax increases, lawsuits for those who knowingly contributed to climate change while denying and misleading the public about their actions, and raise pollution penalties moving forward. It's a clear and direct pathway to generate capital and hold the people who choose to put profits above the well-being of humanity accountable for their actions. Recognizing that the plan itself is disruptive, the Sanders team is proactive with solutions to mitigate damage to our citizens. The plan calls for the divestment of federal pensions from fossil fuels, but doesn't mention any specific order, like in terms of which order they're going to do these policies for. I would imagine that the future Sanders administration would want to do this first, to divest the pensions first, to avoid causing more loss than necessary to pensioners. The plan continues to explain how the administration will pressure universities, financial institutions, and other investors to transition investments out of fossil fuels and into clean energy bonds. Now, I'm not an expert investor, so take the following with a grain of salt, but if I had my money in dirty energy investments, I'd be concerned about waiting to divest until after the primary, because if Bernie wins, it's going to be too late by then. Bernie's plan is clear. 2030, not 2050 is the goal. And it's the only realistic plan, despite criticism that the technology is not there yet. Something that's not often talked about is that we're already doing real damage to Earth, and it's unlikely to be remedied even if we meet our targets. 2050 is a number put forward as an absolute last option to avoid total meltdown. But recent reports are showing us that the crisis is accelerating faster than we expected because of the complexity of organism Earth. Given that we understand that we don't understand the depth of the challenge, it's reasonable to demand a 2030 transition for humanity. The third takeaway is it'll fast-track the United States back into a position of global leadership. Recently I listened to an interview between Peter Thiel and Eric Weinstein in which Thiel explained his reasoning behind his support for Trump. If you're not aware, he's a very big Trump supporter, was very controversial. And essentially he believed that Hillary Clinton's brand of corporatocracy was the pathway to inevitable destruction, and that Trump was going to be the shake-up that America needed to wake up. Now, it's difficult for me to support an argument for Trump given present hindsight, especially knowing the devastation he's caused to American leadership at a global scale. But in the pursuit of radical truth, which I believe is a necessity for the progressive movement, I can't help but agree with Thiel's assessment to some extent. The neoliberal model of global leadership has created the structure that allowed this catastrophe to manifest. Bernie's Green New Deal shapes a new type of global leadership for the United States. It outlines initiatives such as investing in countries with less economic and political power than us to help them achieve the necessary milestones to avoid global catastrophe. We lead not through rhetoric or force, but by collaboration and cooperation. The plan commits America to promoting peace and aggressively reducing our emissions here at home. We'll invest $200 billion in the Green Climate Fund, which will support the equitable transfer of necessary green technologies. It recognizes that the Pentagon, so essentially that means we're going to help support other nations by giving them access to the most advanced form of green energy technologies so they can invest and build them within their own communities. The plan also recognizes that the Pentagon is the largest institutional polluter in the world and will redirect funds spent on war and weapons to international efforts to support global transition off of fossil fuels. It's combined with ending overseas fossil fuel financing and the renegotiation of trade deals like NAFTA, which were written by billion-dollar companies and allow for special protections for polluters. This aspect of Sanders' team plan resonates deeply with me as a progressive, as it begins to break open the next generation of American leadership, global cooperative projects. If there was ever a plan to make America great, and not in the racist and fear-mongering direction, these projects are it. What excites me most is the latent possibility that opens up with the completion of a successful global project like combating climate change. It will transform universal consciousness on a scale beyond what the moon landing did for America's past. The fourth takeaway is that the Green New Deal revitalizes the American dream. At its core, the American dream is about a sense of personal autonomy within the world. We believe that given appropriate resources, any person can transcend the circumstances that they are born into. It's a cultural belief that ties your work ethic and determination to your success. Now, in many respects, it's a profoundly empowering belief, allowing us to focus on circumstances that are beyond what is. Where the ethos fails is embracing that our institutions are set up in a way that creates a systemic disadvantage for poor people. The Green New Deal finally makes America take a step towards grappling with our past and addresses some of the disparities existing in modern American society. The plan introduces a Water Act, which would provide $34.85 billion to fund programs dedicated to improving the nation's crumbling water infrastructure, a problem that disproportionately impacts poor people of color. The money would go to multiple applications with a focus on helping the rural, small community, and tribal drinking and wastewater systems. It includes money to upgrade existing personal home and statewide infrastructure using materials made in the U.S. It invests in job training and local hiring, prioritizing minority and women-owned businesses as well as community-owned and municipal enterprises. And the plan takes special note to include that funding for parks and public lands will be equitably distributed between urban, suburban, and rural areas. And most importantly, it invests heavily in creating a broader social safety net. Two examples are energy and food assistance to ensure that no one is left behind during this transition. The Green New Deal also incorporates American agricultural workers as part of the solution. It invests in small family-owned farms to update and modernize their practice. The plan also expands research and development into advanced agrarian technologies. Notably, it makes a point to talk about not supporting the existing monopolies and instead keeping the focus local. Thinking politically, much of Trump's base stems from the United States agricultural workers, many of whom have directly experienced the brunt of Trump's ineptitude via his reckless and ill-strategized trade war. The strength of Bernie's plan is that it brings more Americans into a new generation of political, economic, and legal thinking that focuses on collective human benefit over the profits of a tiny minority. These social and industrial investments raise the floor for so many Americans who are trapped in cyclical poverty. Investments in their community infrastructure, so often ignored by their local legislators, will improve the quality of life and peace of mind for millions. There's often something that goes unsaid about the American dream, and that is to achieve it requires a degree of self-actualization, which is incredibly challenging to accomplish if your basic needs are not met. The Green New Deal prioritizes investing in our most disenfranchised to help elevate themselves to heightened degrees of access and agency within our world. The fifth takeaway of the Green New Deal program is that it is about structural reform. For the longest time, I've kept my presidential candidate preferences on the down low. I voted for Bernie in 2016, but I wasn't an extremely vocal supporter. But the Green New Deal changes that for me. I spent a lot of time and effort talking and writing about structural reformation in the past. In fact, I ran an entire political campaign about it recently in New Jersey. And this plan is the first and only plan I've ever seen from present political leadership that presents the United States with a truly progressive alternative. By structuring our energy infrastructure to be a publicly owned entity, we've fundamentally changed the future of the United States for good. The same public ownership model is proposed for democratically controlled and publicly owned broadband infrastructure. Bernie's team does what other administrations have been too afraid to do. recognizing that public investment into core aspects of society need to be organized outside of a for-profit structure. Energy and broadband are two great starting points that will lay the foundation for further expansion of this model. Medicare for All is another example. It would follow the same infrastructure of public ownership, and obviously Bernie Sanders is the proponent of Medicare for All. In the end, the Green New Deal represents a fundamental shift in American society. It provides us a pathway to break free of the corporate dominance that has strangled our institutions and purchased our politicians for so long. It's not perfect, but it's an incredibly bold starting point that can transform American society in a way that allows more people to realize their power more often. Progressives must be open and willing to take time to explore these concepts with family and friends and those in our networks who might be caught up in the Trump fervency. The Green New Deal is a plan that can truly unite people. It invests in those who need it most, both in rural and urban America. If you're fortunate enough to count yourself as someone who might not be on the receiving end of this economic development, wear your support for the plan like a badge of honor. A more collaborative United States begins with our personal decisions to embrace the collective need over personal greeds. These are exciting times, but it's up to us to make it happen. Thanks again for tuning in to The Progressive Perspective and this week's Progress Report.